Welcome to The Faithful Steward. This is a podcast all about sharing biblical wisdom and practical insights in order to help church leaders pursue and teach financial freedom as part of Christian discipleship. We believe this is a spiritual conversation, and this is a place where the church needs to lead the way in order to move our communities forward in how we steward God's resources. I'm your host, James Lenhoff, and I am so passionate about this conversation and helping leaders have the confidence to step into it. We believe that if we help people thrive financially and grow spiritually, it changes everything. And I am so excited to join you on this journey. This podcast is brought to you by Good Sense. If you'd like more information about what we're up to, you can go to our website at goodsensemovement.org. All right, let's get started with today's conversation. Well, Happy New Year. I am so excited for 2024. I hope you are as well. And man, the new year is always an opportunity for us to set some intentionality. You know about New Year's resolutions and the fact that the vast majority of them fail and very few of them really lead to anything. And so we are not talking about New Year's resolutions. The beginning of this year is not a time for us to make destinational resolutions. We will lose this much weight and we will have this much less in credit card debt and I will get this done and this done and this done. That is really setting us up for failure. You know, I talk all the time about the difference between directional goals and destinational goals. And this is really important as we start the conversation today. I don't want us to set destinational goals if we have very little understanding of the direction that we're going in. For example, one of the things I see people do all the time is they set a destination, I will lose 30 pounds, but directionally, they're actually still setting themselves up to gain weight, right? Directionally, they're still eating the same, they're still overeating, they're not exercising, they're doing all these things. And so directionally, they're walking in the opposite direction of their destination, and then they wonder why they never get there. And so often that's true with our finances as well, with our time management. When we think of ourselves as stewards of all of these resources that God has given us, oftentimes we will set destinational goals that are in the opposite direction of what we tend to do. And then we wonder why we just can't seem to get there. And so what I want us to do as a starting point as we prepare ourselves for the coming year is to think about those directions. What are the directional goals that we really want to be intentional about? How do we set ourselves up to start moving in that direction and have less of a focus on the end target and more of an intentionality and a focus on taking steps in the direction of that target? And so let me give you some examples of what I mean by that. If a directional goal that you have is I want to spend more time together with my family, that's a great directional goal. That's a wonderful idea, and it is very vague. So what are some of the small intentional steps for you to move in that direction? We need to be more intentional about the direction and less focused on the destination. This is true when it comes to our financial resources. So often I'll see people say, I will be debt-free by the end of the year. Well, the cash flow that you are managing may make that relatively impossible, or the work that would need to be done in order to accomplish that would involve sacrifices you're actually not really willing to make. And so then you feel like a failure because you've set a destinational goal that you were never going to meet. What we want is direction. What we want is to step in the direction of that goal. We don't need to get there necessarily. We just need to start moving towards it. And maybe we find ourselves in a place where we might be able to get there, but we actually need to start walking in that direction in order for us to even have a chance. And so let me just back up for a second and say, if you are walking into this year and you are not tracking how those resources are being spent financially, how God's resources are being spent, if you are not intentional with how you're approaching your spending, this is a time to start to move in that direction. There is no better time to start tracking and organizing and categorizing your spending than right now in January, when you only have a week's worth of categorizing to do. Let's get started. One of the reasons why I see people struggle with this is they don't start until they have 90 days, 6 months worth of categorization and organizing to do. And they're like, I'll just do it next year. The sooner we get started in the year with some intentionality, the sooner we get to a place of understanding what our life costs us and how we're using God's resources. That's the direction we're heading in. I don't want you to start with a destinational goal of I'm going to cut this much out of my budget and I'm going to have this much less spending in these categories. If you don't even understand what you're currently spending in those categories, let's just get to a place where we know what we spend in each category, where it's all going, so that we can then start eventually to make changes in those different spending categories. Don't start changing things you don't understand yet. And so directionally, tracking, organizing, categorizing, start that now. If you don't have that set up, if you don't have a system in place, we have links in the show notes that'll help you get that started while it's still easy to start. Automate that process to the degree that you can. Get your family involved, get your spouse involved, set some intention for how often you're going to touch base. Is it weekly? You're going to spend 15 minutes talking about money with your spouse once a week? What day are you going to do that? Right? Some of those kinds of directional movements that get you to a place where this is a conversation that's happening frequently enough that you're actually staying on top of it. If you listen to the last podcast that we did, we talked about evaluating last year. Hopefully you did that work, because that will give you really clear understanding of what direction you want to head in 2024. What learnings came out of that work of evaluating where you spent God's resources, how you allocated your time, what you gave your skills to over the course of the year, how you invested yourself in serving others. That work helps us to then see, I want more of this, I want less of that. That's what gives us all the directional decisions that we're making now. So if you haven't done that work or you need help figuring that out, go back and listen to that last podcast and do that work, do that evaluation so that you can turn to 2024 with some really clear understanding of what you'd like to see change. We want to be making progress. So does that look like establishing savings through your employer 401k? Does it look like automating some monthly giving so that you stay on track for generosity this year? This is a great time of year to start establishing some of those autopilot kind of things that will happen without you intervening, without you having to do anything, and it'll start to allow that discipline to just be embedded in your cash flow. Whatever we can automate that puts us in a place where we're moving in that direction will help us to continue to move even further in that direction. And so turn those things on this month. But I don't want you to do any of those changes outside of an understanding of the context of, can you afford those things? I don't want you to go turn on your 401k and find out that means you're going to accumulate more credit card debt. I don't want you to go commit and pledge a certain amount of giving and then find out that it's going to create these crisis moments where you're falling behind on these other bills. We need to make sure we understand what our spending plan is and how we're allocating God's resources. And if there is room, and we know there is, we just can't seem to find it, then one of the best ways to find it is to automate it. Put yourself in a position where from day one in January, we're turning on some of those switches that force us into some discipline that we know we can afford. We just keep finding different ways to use that money instead, and we want to allocate it to saving and giving. We want to allocate it to paying down debt. Put some of your debt payments on an auto payment at a certain dollar amount that'll allow you to be paying extra towards those goals without you having to think about it. Those are the kinds of things that will really help you start to move in the direction that you're trying to get without setting the destination as the target. So in other words, we're not saying we're going to pay all our credit card debt off. We're just saying we're going to start paying extra on our credit cards. That is a directional goal that moves us towards that destination. One of the most important things we can do this time of year is establish our priorities for the coming year. So if you've established your base spending plan, you've got some directional changes in terms of adding some savings or adding some debt payments in order to reduce your overall debt load by the end of the year. All of those things are wonderful, but we also need to really talk through as a family, what are we trying to accomplish this year? What are the things that matter most to us? Every year around this time, my family and I sit down and we work through our plan for the coming year. Are we going to take a vacation? If so, where and how much is that going to cost? Are we going to do other things that are going to cost us extra resources that we didn't plan on? We got a kid going into college this year, so we got to make sure we're planning on what is that going to mean and how much of that are we biting off. And so we're working through what is this year going to cost with all the things that are going to change in this 12-month period. What are the things that we want to make sure we say yes to? Because if we can identify what we're going to say yes to, it helps us then identify what we have to say no to. And so if we're going to take this vacation and it costs this much, that means we're not going to be able to do these other things. We can't do this trip. We can't participate in these extracurriculars because we're aiming at this target that's more important. And so it is so helpful for us to crystallize what we have to put down in order to confidently pick up the things that matter most. This is the time to evaluate all of those priorities and organize them into your non-negotiables. What are the things that absolutely have to happen? And that means these other things absolutely can't happen. It is so helpful to have that conversation, crystallize that with your family so that you've all agreed that putting these things down has to happen and it's worth it, because saying no to these things is what allows us to confidently say yes to the stuff we've all agreed is what matters most. This is a great time to do that work. And then once you've done that work, once you've established your priorities, you know these are the things we're saying yes to, this is what all of that looks like, then you should be able to get pretty close to establishing your lifestyle cap. If this is what we're doing in this 12 months, then this is how much money we need in order to do those things. This is what that takes. This is how much we're going to save. This is how much we're going to pay down on our debt. This is our vacation. This is the stuff we're going to do. And that total is X. That is your lifestyle cap. That is what you've intentionally chosen as you step into this year. You say, this is contentment. This is delight. This is fullness. This is all the stuff we've decided as a family matters most to us. And so this is what that takes. The beauty of setting that ahead of time, deciding as you step into the year, is that means that when the lure of more comes along and says, hey, you know what you really need is this thing. You know what would really make you happy is more of that. You can say, no, we already decided. We were intentional walking into this year that this is enough. And that means this, whatever comes in above that, is extra. And guess what we get to do with extra? We get to step further into generosity. We get to obey the voice of the Lord and do what he's asking us to do with the extra he gave us, because he gave it to us for a reason. And we have already satisfied our own contentment, our own enjoyment, our own indulgence in connection and relational experience and all the beauty of life. We don't need more. So that more can be more confidently given away. If you can do that work, it will move you in the direction of contentment, of confidence, of a sense of steadiness and peace, because you know the life that you want and you know what that life costs you. Imagine the freedom that unlocks if we do that work now. Recognize as we walk this year out, those things might have to change. Something unexpected may come up. Something may knock you off of your plan. Something may be way different than you hoped it would be, and that's okay. None of this stuff is set in stone, but to the degree that you can set it up and be intentional ahead of time, you take out the risk of being overly reactional, overly emotional, and making decisions that aren't grounded in the vision that you had for this year at the beginning. You're just making decisions that are reacting to your emotional state at the time. We need to set that foundational vision in place so that we can come back to it as a reference point to test our decisions throughout the year. And so I would encourage you to do this work, to set the course for this year, have the conversations that need to be had in order to move you forward in the directions that you're trying to move. Grow in your giving to get to a 10% tithe. Grow in your savings to get to at least a 10% savings rate. Continue to move your family forward in the discipline of honoring God with the resources that He's given you to manage. Put some of these boundaries in place. Draw some of these lines now when it's relatively easy to do because it's January. We haven't gotten into the crazy and the weeds of the year as it comes. We are starting now with a clear vision and a really clearly identified plan to track our spending, to understand what our life costs, and to be intentional with the decisions that we're making with the resources God gives us this year. Well, thank you so much for listening to the Faithful Steward podcast. Be sure to check out the show notes for links and other information that we mentioned in today's episode. Also, be sure to check out our website at goodsensemovement.org to get all the resources we offer churches to help equip them in teaching financial stewardship to their community. If you have any questions or any topics you want to make sure we cover on our show, you can email me at jameslenhoff@goodsensemovement.org. I'd love to hear from you. I hope you all have a great week. We'll talk to you next week.